everyone. Welcome to Thoughtful Thursdays by Tornado IP, where innovation meets strategy and intellectual property. I'm here today with three guests. For the first time, this is a panel to discuss the topic of AI from industry perspective, commercialization, compliance, and reality. And I am thinking that the best introduction for each of my audience members is to introduce herself, because I would love to have a little bit of their perspective of how they're going to bring a really interesting background to this topic. So Barb, would you introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Sylvia. So I'm Barbara Nyland. I have over 30 years of experience in the chemical industry from a technology perspective as well as from a regulatory compliance perspective. And I'm particularly interested in the discussion today because AI is still somewhat in its infancy, and the compliance area is a very complicated one. So I think there's a lot of promise, but there's also a lot of risk.
Ashley.
Yeah, so my name's Ashley Hessline. I have spent over 20 years in the pharmaceutical industry working on large molecules biotech products, specifically in process development and early stage clinical manufacturing. So moving molecules both through the pharmaceutical side as well as the regulatory interface and the patient interface. Currently, I've switched more into AI and bringing AI into big pharma applications, and also independently consulting.
How about Paula?
Hi, Sylvia. Yes, hi everyone. I'm Paula Hippus, and I also have spent about 29 years in the chemicals and technology industry, mostly focused in the R&D and product development space across many different markets and industries throughout my career. I agree with Barb that where we are today in AI is really kind of in its infancy, and really figuring out where it can be most useful and can help companies move faster and be more creative is where I'm really interested in seeing it go.
So I think that actually sets us up really well for the first couple questions that I have. And so the first one is from your own industry vantage point. So we have chemical industry and pharma industry. What does AI implementation actually look like in the real world, in any way that you have seen it? And what do outsiders usually underestimate about getting it to work? Barb.
So, we have been playing around with the use of AI. Where does it work? Where doesn't it work? And I think we're finding that in the compliance area, where you have very clear rules-based, data-driven, where you have hard constraints, AI can work quite well. However, we do find where you're open to interpretation, where there is subjectivity around regulations, you still need the human element to be able to do those interpretations and to be able to ensure that you're coming to the right decision. The pilots that we've had with AI have been quite effective, I think, because they've been very well defined. However, in a more generic and a more generalized application of AI, that's where we find it tends to fall apart, because I think we're not clear where it works and where it doesn't. From the outside, I think people maybe overestimate sometimes what AI can do, and they think that it's going to take away large swaths of work, but certainly at this point it's not taking away human insight, human judgment, and strategic thinking that is really required in the compliance space.
Ashley, what do you think?
Yeah, so just to check in, it's about where have we used it, and then what are some of the limitations, correct? Yeah. So, one of the most straightforward things has been in writing. So the companies I've worked with have built an internal AI tool, so you don't have to put proprietary data on external servers. So you're not inadvertently teaching, other companies about things that you want to keep proprietary. So that allowed us to do things like help with authorship of documents, or at the very least, emails. Sometimes I would use it just to rephrase something, or if I'm upset about something, to sort of soften it maybe. So that is, I think, a no-brainer, and anyone can implement that. In terms of process development and early stage clinical manufacturing, it wasn't in regular use at this time. Overall, in pharmaceuticals, what I've seen the most uptake in the industry is particularly in the areas of drug discovery. So in the research stage, where they're deciding what molecules could be of interest, and then sort of designing those molecules to limit side effects or toxicities. There's been just some really interesting stuff published around that. So that gets around to this question of patient impact or customer impact, because you're doing everything in the research stage where you're not yet implementing anything that could inadvertently cause us, a problem. So that's one area I think that AI is fantastic, and not in that area, so I haven't seen that used directly, but I read quite a bit about that being implemented. The second area I think that's the most usable for pharmaceuticals has been clinical operations. So this is when you're enrolling patients, monitoring patients, screening patients, checking patients for compliance. There's a lot of paperwork around that. And I know that there's quite a few companies out there that are helping in the clinical aspect. So this is more management, they're not it's no medical decisions or anything like that, but just the nuts and bolts of getting patients onboarded, trained, verified, etc. So both at the really early end for drug discovery and design, and then at the late end for patient interfaces in clinical trials. And those are the two main areas I've heard of for pharmaceuticals. In the middle, where it's more the process development, clinical manufacturing, it's more, my experience, more dabbling or trying things out at this point. It's not a systematic approach. I have more thoughts about that, but I think I'll pass that on to the next guest.
Sure. Couple of thoughts. I agree completely that across industry, across companies, using what's available to help with writing emails, with writing reports, with pulling information together and presenting it in a clear, concise way is a place where all employees can really use AI today. From a project perspective, for me, the one that stands out that has been worked on internally where I am today is about image recognition in the diagnostic space. And so being able to take some of like a medical scan that's saved as an image and identify an abnormal cells, anomalies, right, at a computer level versus what the human eye can really see and detect has been a huge win from an AI perspective. And it's an area where I think there will continue to be significant development going forward. So, sort of like Ashley, I see one at sort of the beginning, simple end, let's train people on what things can do. And then that diagnostics reading being more at the other end of, hey, we know that this is an area to do it. Some of our other pilots are kind of in the middle of that R&D development space to try to understand where do we have strong enough data that we can train an AI model to help us predict what to do next, because that's going to be where the powerful use of AI fits. It's where the model or the AI agent can see something that the human eye doesn't necessarily make the connection to. I agree with Barb. We're quite a ways away from that, from being able to replace that human ingenuity and thought process and ability to recognize things. Those are the areas that we're working on to make that next big leap.
I have a little bit of a follow-up question on some things that I think all of you touched on a little bit, but for like the audience that doesn't live inside your industries, could you comment a little bit more on what makes AI implementation especially difficult in a regulated industry compared to other types of business settings? Barb.
I think the unique challenge, and I don't think that this is unique to the chemical industry particularly. I believe it's any regulated, heavily regulated industry versus other industries. Okay, so heavily regulated versus not. The necessity here is the accuracy of compliance, the auditability of compliance. You need to have full documentation that you're complying with all regulations. You can clearly be audited. There are legal and ethical implications of getting things wrong. So I think there's this very rigorous standard that needs to be met in terms of how you're complying within that industry. And while what Ashley and Paula have said, AI is very helpful in scanning through regulations to see what is similar and what isn't. It is very helpful in scanning a product composition to see how it might comply to a regulation. Ultimately, the complexity comes in making that final decision and doing the necessary risk assessments to ensure that you are in compliance. I don't know if I've answered your question. It's just that in these types of heavily regulated industries where the regulations are complex, they're growing, they're fragmented, there is a lot of room for interpretation. AI can absolutely help in doing a lot of the data-driven work and doing some of the data mining, in helping to put together the structure. But I keep pointing to the decision making, understanding the subtleties, understanding the edge cases where there's room for interpretation, where you still need that human element. So I think AI is inevitable. I think it will play a bigger role in the future, but we're at the stage now of understanding what that is and what that looks like.
What are your thoughts?
Yeah, again, to remember, so mesmerized by what Barbara's saying.
The regulatory,
Yeah.
like our audience is not necessarily inside
Right.
a company. Yes, the regulatory, yeah.
Yeah. So I will say that having been in pharmaceuticals, one of the common answers we get when we try to do something different is like, no, you can't make any changes. This is a regulatory requirement, et cetera. And what I find is that companies and people can be actually really inflexible. And this is an example of innovation, and innovation challenges your assumptions and causes you to think about things differently. So I think, like Barb, I do believe that AI is inevitable. In specific, when I've evaluated AI use for process development and then moving into maybe like a commercial application. So I'm going to just like describe that a little bit. It's quite time consuming for biotech manufacturing lots to do a lot release so that you can move that material forward into like packaging to send out to patients. So a lot release involves evaluating all the batch records that were written, checking for problems. It involves pulling all the test results together from different locations, making conclusions about whether they were pass-fail within the acceptance criteria, looking at any deviations that happen and whether those have been closed out suitably and, are not compromising the batch quality. So like lot release is an example of, it's a pretty standardized process, but it also does involve potentially some subjective judgment. So if you think about moving AI into a use case like that, the FDA and EMA have both recently come out with regulations specifically around pharmaceutical manufacturing in a commercial situation. And the requirements are not that different from the requirements about in use of any computerized systems. And that requirement is around validating or proving that that will act as expected. I mean, one of the things that you mentioned, Barbara, was like traceability, right? How do you, if you're having AI making a judgment call versus doing things that are more manual, like pulling data and compiling it, if it's taking that next step, which is making the judgment call, how are you ensuring that it's doing it correctly, consistently? How are you ensuring that over time there's no drift, or that if there's a drift in the data that's noticed or flagged, or because one concern with AI is if it's taking data, pulling it together, calculating, if the data are shifting or something's shifting in the environment, you can get drifts within that. And so there's just expectations that the regulatory agencies have on proving the consistency, which is under the validation umbrella. So I think my personal recommendation for the moment, and this can change, things are changing so fast, is at the moment, it's better to just really utilize AI's capability to time save by pulling content and doing a lot of that. But the judgment calls are still better in the hands of humans, especially if they have patient or other impacts. So for now, just keep that line a little more distinct. It makes it easier from a burden of proof point of view for the company.
I think those were great answers, and I don't really have anything else different to add to it.
That was good. So I wanted to dig in a little bit a topic that last week I was investigating. Last week I met with Andi Kirk, who used to manage the knowledge center in big chemical industry, managing internal information like research reports, things like that, research notebooks. And from that perspective, I'm really interested in your thoughts of how that data is usable. Does AI help? Can it access to that kind of internal knowledge in your industries?
So certainly, and I believe Ashley had rightly pointed out, as long as you have an internal sandbox, if you will, So if you have the firewall so that any proprietary information is not seeping out into the larger space, yes, AI can play an important role in being able to sift through research documents, through tech data sheets, through other supplier SDS. We have found in some early use of AI that it is very valuable in finding commonalities, in being able to summarize massive amounts of documents, in being able to find some consistencies in themes. So yes, to answer your question, I think the tools that we have today, and certainly what we see being developed that become more sophisticated, can play a very vital role in helping to summarize, to digest that information, and help ultimately the investigator to draw insight from it. However, the concern always is around maintaining and containing and controlling confidential information. So you really need to ensure that whatever you're implementing, you have those safeguards in place, okay? Because you really don't want to be training, as Ashley says, the broader world in your confidential information.
Ashley, any additional thoughts on that?
I think that's a good description. Yeah.
One of the other things I just explore this topic a little bit more that the previous episode discussed is how it's actually not always easy to get the scientists to record their data. Like we were supposed to be really good at that when we were growing up and keeping lab notebooks and writing up research papers and thesis. And that's not that has been a challenge in some industries. And so if you don't have recorded, detailed experimental data, and basically like you have scientists that you have to rely on for consulting expertise. And I mean, this is not really a AI only issue. I was wondering if you had anything to add to that or thoughts for that, Barb, or any of you really.
Take a turn, Paula.
Yeah, I think there are a few limitations associated with trying to use AI to summarize data that scientists collected in their lab notebooks, right? There are still limitations associated with reading images and pulling numbers off of images. And so depending on how the original information was saved, there's information that could be lost. As you were just talking about, Sylvia, there's also information that was never written down in the notebook. So as much as we try to record everything, there are other parameters we may not be controlling at the time, and so we didn't think to document them in the process of running the experiment. There is definitely a lot of validation that needs to be done when we create these AI agents and we set them on a task like this, because they do occasionally hallucinate and create answers that didn't exist in the source material. And so in order to get to a point where we can utilize and really harness the data that was generated over those many generations of scientists going forward, we need to have humans doing the validation and checking and ensuring that what's coming out is actually based on the information that was there.
Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, with regards to data, I think so. Like along the decades of working, I have been involved in various digitalization initiatives. So this is, pre AI being such a heavy topic. There have been questions about machine learning, questions like, could you get a piece of equipment to alert you when it's running out of trend that it needs a preventive maintenance, for example, versus having a human watching that. One of the consistent limitations in this case has been the quality of the data. And quality of the data means several different things. One is sort of consistency. So are people writing the same words down? Is it like, I think of it mentally as like a drop-down menu gives you a few categories of topics, whereas if it's like a free-form entry, you could get people writing it in 20 different ways. So when you're trying to extract that data, it's easier for a computer system to recognize like 2 or 3 options on a drop-down menu versus, the free-form the entry point. So I know that like in previous digitalization initiatives, a lot of the discussion was around taxonomy, like how could you get a scientist to write it the same way every time. Honestly, those were super time consuming and sort of counterintuitive with if you're trying to get a scientist to think openly and try new things and be innovative. If they're sitting there worrying about how they're calling something. I mean, maybe they've never run that experiment before. There's a new word they need to use. So it always felt like a conflict. I think AI levels up from that where it can handle a much larger like world of names. It's not limited in that way in the same way, but it is still like data and data quality are still a huge piece. So when I looked at, how could we implement more AI and of the okay, look, for me the question is what's a useful use case or what's a good use case in your area. One of the areas is consistently pulling data from all the different sources in order to make the scientific conclusions. So that could be like testing externally at a CMO or a CDMO. That could be manufacturing unit operation that's run by a process skid that records it in an area setup. It could be back pressure on a filter where it's a number on a meter. Like there's all this information. There are companies out there who are specializing in transforming that complex web of content into something that pulls together, and then the AI is done sort of a layer on top of that. So I think that's really interesting. I don't have any specific recommendations at this point, but I do think it's a current gap in the industry is getting your data in a suitable setup that you can then extract the information that you need from it using various tools.
I really want to emphasize what both Ashley and Paula have said around data quality, and uniformity of data, because absolutely that's also something that we see in the compliance space. There's one other item that I did want to reference. Often in compliance, we're looking at toxicology reports, and we don't necessarily have explicit toxicology studies of every compound. And so we do something called read across, where we're trying to predict from the findings of one particular chemical or family of chemicals how another related chemical with a similar composition, molecular structure, would react. And this kind of read across is predictive toxicology, and there are a lot of modeling tools that can do this, but AI can also play a role with it. But to Paula's point, what we find, if the data are not clear, if there's not consistency around how a researcher is recording that data, or if you're purchasing a study, how that data was collected, you end up with what you call hallucinations, and it can lead you to very wrong conclusions. So, I think, and to your point, Ashley, it's not just AI, which is kind of the hot new thing, but a lot of the digitization and a lot of these tools, there's tremendous value in it. But if you don't have the foundational data correct, if you don't have the disciplined structure around that data, how it is measured, how it's input, how it's assessed, that's where I think you start to drift, and you can go off very quickly.
Really interesting. What just came to my mind as you were describing that is I listen to a lot of medical podcasts, and I'm not going to say the names of which ones I listen to, but one of them was commenting on the other one. And it said, this person who's doing this podcast, he goes into Medline, which is the database of journal articles for medicine, and pulls up a certain topic that they're interested in, and then pulls up 100 articles and bumps it into ChatGPT and has summarized it, and then he's doing his podcast. Now, what he doesn't do when he's doing that is actually look at the individual articles to see if big conclusions were drawn on 3 patients, for example. The quality of, and these are scientific published articles, and the quality of how the data was collected is highly variable, and you would actually really need to do the work to make that assessment. If I'm writing my PhD and I'm reading and researching this paper, some of them, I would look at how the data was done first before I decided to include that into my thesis conclusions. And that's not being done. But I was wondering, and so this is really, really interesting in medicine, because there's certainly a lot of articles like that in the medical space. And what I was wondering is, I wonder if I could just create a phenomenally good prompt in my space. I'm interested in some kind of a cancer, that certain types of studies are done to study that kind of cancer. Can I teach an AI agent to actually evaluate how the experiments are done, so that it'll toss out some papers that were not done right, and then give me the summary of the 100 articles, and then I'm going to have a way better podcast. What are your thoughts on that? Maybe Ashley?
Well, there's 2 thoughts I have. One is that there's a Stanford professor who just published an article, I think it was in Nature. What he did is he created in his lab, with his graduate students, biotech companies, and those were entirely generative AI bots that did this. So I saw him give a talk on it. He had the optimist, the immunologist, the sort of cranky scientist. And so he built in maybe like these sort of personality types to the bots where their job was like the skeptic, I think, was the cranky scientist. So maybe that would be one way of addressing what you're describing, which is like, so I think he had six, if I remember right, six people on the board or in this fake company. And then he ran multiples in parallel. And they, the claim is that they generated several sort of therapeutic molecules. I mean, I don't know if that's true, but I think that could be, if this was something you wanted to do from a business point of view, you could build these individual personality types or generative AI, I don't know what to call them, people that could act that way. Yeah, I think that's totally possible. And then the second thing I was thinking is, so I am an advisor right now for a company named Defy, who is based, well, I mean, there's a lot of people from the Bay Area where AI sort of ecosystem is quite healthy. And one of the main things we're building is an FDA interface database. And what we're doing is we're testing, like if you look at Anthropic or Google or other companies that have AI models like Claude or Gemini, you can query them. And then we've built a separate one. We've been training using expertise from FDA. So these are employees of the company that have been working in the FDA and kind of know not just the publicly available guidance, but internally how the FDA works and what they want to know about. When they ask the questions, what are they trying to get to? And there's a big difference now over time after having training this model with specific experts versus the like large language model approach where it looks out into the whole internet and everything that's publicly available and comes up with some answers versus something that had that content, but now you've trained it in a more accurate way. So the accuracy of the responses we're getting are different. And the reason I mention that is because you asked the question about, we're talking about the quality of the data and we're talking about the quality of the query. But I actually think the quality of what who you're asking that to and how it's been trained makes a huge difference. That's what we're finding. Yeah.
Any other thoughts on that?
I would like to reinforce what Ashley is saying, because what I am seeing in the chemical compliance space is that there are a number of commercially available AI tools that are really coming up strong. And because they're based on the proprietary databases where they're pulling the information from, they're using the guidance from the EPA, they're using the guidance from CEFIC, they're using the guidance from the regulatory agencies. The quality of the response is much better, much more refined, and you can trust it. So, I think commercially available tools will be a big part of the future also, and it's how do you use those.
I have a bunch of lightning round questions to finish us off, but some of them we kind of already accomplished, I think, but let's try it again and we can all go around and see what we think. So, what matters more for success? Better data or better prompts?
Yes, and
I know.
right? I don't think you can pick one or the other. Well, except as you guys were just highlighting, when you have a trained system that already has good data, then it's your prompts that are important.
Yeah.
I think
So,
that good data
go on.
comes first, if I had to pick one.
Yeah.
One place where AI will add value first: lab, plant, quality, regulatory, or supply chain, like pulling us back into the industry setting.
I like it in quality. I've seen some companies out there that are trying to take the time consuming, like deviation investigations, review upon excursion. Some of these things are really great. They're out there commercially available. I think quality is a nice one for
Yeah, and I
first.
guess I would have tied that into manufacturing. So I think it is kind of manufacturing quality to
Yeah.
understand do we have the tolerances and the conditions that we're operating under, optimized, right? I think that AI can help with that pretty quickly.
Yes. I'm thinking also inputs that are coming out of pilot plants and smaller lab scale. I think their AI can really help you to sift through, are you on the right track?
Biggest adoption blocker: security, culture, data, validation, or cost?
I think security is what stops things initially. I think there's a fear of data getting outside.
I also think culture, the
Hmm.
willingness to use the tools, use them correctly, And then at the first sign where something doesn't work, people say, I'm not going to use it anymore. So I think culture plays an important role.
Yeah, and on top of that, adding to the culture topic, right now it can feel like AI is on top of your normal job, meaning you have to do all the stuff. Most people I know nowadays are doing it with less people than they were 2 years ago. Compression and the amount of work has consistently gone up, but the headcount was always being pushed down. And so if someone's asked, well, why don't you bring some innovation here? Why don't you make this more efficient? That's on top of them executing, and that I think that falls more into the culture, or maybe time. It takes time to try new things out and get them to work.
One skill every technical leader should build now for the AI era.
I would say stay open, openness and willingness, to say like, this doesn't make sense to me, but let me just listen to what it is. Yeah. And then disruption. I mean, disruption, like the pace of disruption feels crazy, logarithmic in terms of disruptions per year that you're living with in your field. Yeah.
And
I'd say it's get comfortable being uncomfortable.
yes. But it's not also just glomming onto the next newest shiny thing. Really making the decision, does this help? Where should I use it? Where is it judicious to use this technology? Just don't go into it thinking it's going to be a panacea.
Thank you. I think those were all my questions. Any other last thoughts?
Is it okay to ask you, Sylvia, about
Yes.
anything in IP that you have thoughts around using AI?
So I'm observing AI usage in the IP space, and definitely law firms are using AI for help with the draft. But I think what is a theme that I'm hearing from different people from all different functions is the strategic thinking, the big picture thinking of how to best protect your innovation in a way that's really going to be able to provide money and protect the market. That strategic thought has to come from a human, because it has so many inputs, so many functional inputs about what a company is doing and what innovation is all about, where it's going in the future. That the strategic element ought to come from a human. And it was funny. I was talking to someone from a consulting company last week, and I was telling him how my daughter Sabrina is a phenomenal strategic thinker. And she told me recently that when she learns to play a brand new strategic board game at a friend's house, she usually, first time around, she wins because she loves this stuff and she's very strategic. But the second time she plays the games, she comes to a complete stall because now she really knows all the rules. So she envisions all the possible elements or ramifications if she makes a move. So I think of AI in this way. If you really feed AI all the little pieces of cross-functional input that it needs to have to make a proper strategic business move or IP strategy move, it's just gonna blow up. It's just kind of like Sabrina's can't possibly think to move. And that comes to that 80-20 instinctive strategic part of a leader's decision making, which is very important. And I don't think AI is doing that from my perspective. And I might not be as advanced in the AI realm as Ashley or some others, but that's my perspective.
Maybe a future podcast. Yeah.
All right. This is great to talk to you guys. I'm gonna turn this off, and thank you everyone for. I'm gonna hit the stop button. Thank you everyone for joining us today.